immigration numbers game, when political promises meet economic reality. Right, let's cut through the noise, shall we? While Nigel Farage has been making bold promises about transforming Britain's immigration landscape, the economic realities on the ground tell a rather different story, one that's far more complex than the sound bites would have you believe. And here's where it gets particularly interesting. The very statistics being bandied about by politicians like Sadiq Khan reveal just how muddled this entire debate has become. Khan recently took to LBC with some rather startling claims that skilled migrants contribute £16,000 annually to our economy, while British skilled workers contribute a mere £800. Now, before you spit out your tea, let's examine what's actually happening here, because a statistical sleight of hand reveals everything wrong with how we're discussing immigration policy in this country. The Migration Advisory Committee's data, which Khan was supposedly citing, does indeed show skilled migrant workers contributing around £16,300 annually. But here's the rub. Khan's comparison is fundamentally flawed. That £800 figure he attributed to British skilled workers? It's actually the average contribution of all UK-born adults, including the unemployed, retired, and economically inactive. It's like comparing a Formula One driver's lap time to the average speed of everyone in the car park, including those whose cars won't start. When we look at the proper comparison, UK-born working adults versus skilled migrants, the gap narrows significantly to £14,400 versus £16,300. Still a difference, yes, but hardly the dramatic chasm Khan presented. This kind of statistical manipulation would make even the most creative accountant blush, and it highlights a fundamental problem with how immigration policy is being discussed at the highest levels. But here's where the plot thickens considerably. In a series of private briefings with government officials, Khan has reportedly been sounding alarm bells about the economic catastrophe that would follow any attempt at massive deportation schemes, the very policies that some of the more extreme voices in the immigration debate have been quietly advocating. Sources close to City Hall suggest that Khan has been actively advising both Nigel Farage and Sir Keir Starmer about the potentially devastating consequences of large-scale forced removals, painting a picture of economic disruption that would dwarf even the most pessimistic Brexit projections. The London Mayor's warnings, according to these sources, focus on the immediate fiscal shock that would ripple through the economy if significant numbers of working migrants were suddenly removed from the workforce. Khan's analysis suggests that such a policy would create not just humanitarian concerns, but an economic disaster that would cost the Treasury billions in lost tax revenue while simultaneously increasing the burden on public services as businesses struggle to fill critical roles. This behind-the-scenes advocacy reveals a rather different Khan from the one making questionable statistical comparisons on radio shows. Away from the public spotlight, he appears to be playing a more sophisticated game, using his position as Mayor of London to warn political leaders across the spectrum about the practical impossibility of implementing the kind of aggressive deportation policies that play well in certain political circles but would be economically ruinous in practice. The irony here is palpable. While Khan publicly mangles statistics to make a point about migrant contributions, privately he is making the more nuanced argument that the economic integration of skilled migrants into the British economy has reached a point where their sudden removal would cause systemic damage. It's as if he recognizes that his public statistical games are politically necessary theater, while the real policy work happens in private conversations where the stakes are too high for soundbite politics. This dual approach from Khan illuminates something crucial about Farage's grand plans that often gets lost in the public debate. The Reform UK leader has consistently argued for dramatic reductions in immigration, promising swift results and immediate benefits for British workers. Yet the very data being misrepresented by his political opponents actually complicates his narrative in ways that suggest his policies might take considerably longer to deliver the promised outcomes than his supporters expect, if they can be delivered at all without causing significant economic disruption. The skilled worker visa system, which attracts migrants earning at least £38,700 annually, is designed precisely to bring in people who contribute significantly to our economy from day one. These aren't individuals coming here to claim benefits. They're ineligible for most government support in their initial years. They are typically aged between 20 and 69, meaning they are less likely to be heavy users of NHS services compared to our aging domestic population. More importantly, they become integral to the functioning of key sectors of the British economy in ways that make their sudden removal economically catastrophic. Khan's private warnings to Farage and Starmer reportedly focus on specific sectors where the concentration of skilled migrants has reached critical mass. In London's financial services sector, for instance, the removal of significant numbers of qualified professionals would not just create skills gaps, it could trigger a confidence crisis that might see entire operations relocate to Frankfurt or Paris. The tech sector, already struggling with post-Brexit talent acquisition, could face an exodus of companies if immigration policies became too aggressive. The healthcare implications are perhaps even more stark. Khan's analysis, shared with government officials, suggests that any policy targeting skilled migrants could devastate the NHS workforce in London, where foreign-born healthcare professionals make up a significant proportion of critical specialties. The mayor's warnings paint a picture of hospitals struggling to maintain basic services if deportation policies were to sweep up healthcare workers along with their intended targets. So when Farage promises that reducing immigration will immediately improve conditions for British workers, he's overlooking a rather inconvenient truth that Khan has been privately emphasizing to anyone who will listen. The current system is already bringing in people who are net contributors to the Treasury, and they become so economically integrated that removing them doesn't magically create better-paid jobs for British workers. Instead, it potentially reduces the tax revenue needed to fund the very public services and infrastructure improvements that would benefit everyone, while creating massive disruption in sectors that British workers depend on for their own employment. The timing issue becomes even more pronounced when you consider that economic policy changes don't operate in a vacuum, something Khan appears to understand far better in his private briefings and in his public pronouncements. Labor market adjustments take years, not months. Skills gaps don't disappear overnight, and the complex machinery of modern immigration policy can't be reversed with a flick of a switch, regardless of how compelling the political rhetoric might sound. The economic integration of skilled migrants into the British economy has created dependencies that would take years to unwind safely, if such unwinding were even desirable. Khan's dual messaging strategy reveals a fundamental tension at the heart of contemporary immigration politics. Public discourse demands simple narratives and clear villains or heroes, leading to the kind of statistical manipulation we saw in his LBC appearance. But the actual policy challenges require nuanced understanding of economic interdependencies that don't translate well into radio soundbites or Twitter threads. What's particularly telling is how both sides of this debate seem determined to cherry-pick data that supports their predetermined conclusions, even as the private conversations reveal a much more complex reality. Khan's statistical gymnastics serve his pro-immigration stance in public forums, while his private warnings about deportation focus on practical economic consequences that transcend political positioning. Meanwhile, Fair Eye supporters dismiss economic evidence that doesn't align with their preferred narrative, apparently unaware that even sympathetic politicians like Khan are privately arguing that their more extreme policy prescriptions will be economically catastrophic. The British public, meanwhile, is left trying to navigate between misleading statistics, oversimplified promises, and a political class that seems incapable of having honest public conversations about the actual trade-offs involved in immigration policy. Khan's private advocacy against mass deportation suggests he understands these trade-offs perfectly well, but his public statistical game suggests he believes the electorate isn't sophisticated enough to handle the full complexity of the debate. The University of Oxford's Migration Observatory puts it rather diplomatically. There's no single correct estimate of migrants' fiscal impact because different studies make different assumptions. What they don't say, but what's blindingly obvious to anyone paying attention, is that politicians routinely select whichever assumptions best serve their political purposes in public, while privately acknowledging far more complex realities when actual policy decisions are at stake. This brings us to a rather uncomfortable truth about Fair Eye's immigration timeline that Khan's private briefings have reportedly emphasized. Even if his policies were implemented tomorrow, which they won't be, given the current political landscape, the economic effects would unfold over years, not months. Immigration systems are like oil tankers. They change direction slowly and with considerable effort. The skill shortages in our NHS, our tech sector, and our agricultural industry didn't develop overnight, and they won't be resolved overnight either. More problematically, attempting to resolve them through mass deportation could create immediate crises that would take decades to repair. Khan's warnings about the practical impossibility of large-scale deportations reportedly focus on logistical as well as economic concerns. The administrative machinery required to identify, process and remove significant numbers of people simply doesn't exist in its current form. Building such a system would cost billions and take years, during which the economic uncertainty alone would likely cause a very economic disruption that Khan warns would follow actual deportations. The real question isn't whether Farah's policies are taking longer than expected. It's whether the expectations were ever realistic in the first place, and whether the more extreme versions of these policies could be implemented without causing economic catastrophe. When political promises collide with economic complexity, reality tends to win, though it often takes rather longer than anyone would prefer. Khan's private advocacy suggests he believes the economic complexity has reached a point where certain policy options are simply off the table, regardless of their political appeal. What we're witnessing is a masterclass in how not to conduct serious policy discussions, but also a glimpse into how serious policy discussions actually happen behind closed doors. Khan's statistical manipulation undermines legitimate concerns about immigration policy in public forums, while his private warnings about deportation suggest a sophisticated understanding of economic realities that rarely surface in public debate. Farah's timeline promises set expectations that economic realities simply cannot meet, but his private conversations with Khan and others may reveal a more nuanced understanding of the constraints involved. Both public approaches do a disservice to the British people, who deserve honest assessments rather than political theatre. But Khan's private advocacy suggests that at least some political leaders understand the stakes involved and are working behind the scenes to prevent policies that could cause genuine economic harm, even as they engage in questionable statistical games in public. The Migration Advisory Committee's research reveals that skilled migrants make their highest net contributions in their early years in the UK, before their usage of public services potentially increases over time. This suggests that immigration policy needs to be viewed through a long-term lens, not the short-term electoral cycles that dominate political thinking. Khan's private warnings reportedly emphasize this temporal mismatch, arguing that policies designed for electoral cycle could cause economic damage that would persist for decades. For Farah's supporters, this presents a challenging reality that Khan has apparently been emphasizing in private meetings. Even the most dramatic policy changes will require years to fully implement and assess. The economic disruption of sudden changes might actually harm British workers in the short term, regardless of the long-term benefits his policies might eventually deliver. More concerning, Khan's analysis suggests that certain policy options, particularly mass deportation, could cause permanent damage to Britain's economic competitiveness that no amount of subsequent policy adjustment could repair. The statistical battle between Khan and Farah's camp reveals something deeper about our political discourse. We become so focused on winning arguments that we've forgotten about solving problems. Khan's dodgy statistics don't make immigration concerns disappear, and Farah's timeline promises don't make economic reality bend political will. But Khan's private advocacy suggests that at least some politicians are attempting to grapple with the actual policy challenges, even as they engage in public theatre. What this entire episode demonstrates is that serious immigration policy requires serious economic analysis, not soundbite statistics and unrealistic timelines. The British people deserve better than politicians who treat complex economic data like a pick-and-mix counter, selecting only the bits that taste good while ignoring the more challenging flavors. Khan's dual approach, statistical games in public, serious economic analysis in private, suggests he knows this perfectly well, but believes the public discourse has become too degraded for honest conversation. The truth is that immigration policy, like most economic policy, operates on geological timescales compared to political ones. Farah's promises of swift transformation were always going to clash with the methodical pace of economic change. The delay in seeing results isn't necessarily a failure of policy. It might simply be the difference between political time and economic time. But Khan's warnings about mass deportation suggest that some policies could produce immediate results, immediate economic catastrophe. But here's what should concern us all. While politicians argue over statistics and timelines in public, they are having very different conversations in private about the genuine constraints on policy options. Khan's advocacy against mass deportation reveals that serious politicians understand the economic stakes involved, even as they engage in statistical manipulation for public consumption. This disconnect between public theatre and private seriousness is corrosive to democratic discourse and leaves the public uninformed about the actual policy choices being made on their behalf. The immigration debate deserves better than statistical manipulation and unrealistic promises, but it also deserves better than the kind of dual messaging that Khan appears to be engaged in. It deserves honest assessment, realistic timelines, and politicians who are more interested in solving problems and winning arguments, both in public and in private. Until we get that level of maturity in our political discourse, we'll continue to see the gap between promise and delivery that characterizes so much of contemporary British politics. The numbers don't lie, but the people interpreting them certainly do. And that, more than any policy detail, is what's really taking longer than expected to fix. Khan's private warnings about the economic consequences of mass deportation suggest he understands the stakes involved, but his public statistical game suggests he doesn't trust the British people with the full complexity of the debate. That lack of trust is perhaps the most concerning aspect of this entire affair. The reality is that Britain's immigration system has evolved to a point where certain policy options would be economically catastrophic, regardless of their political appeal. Khan's private advocacy recognizes this reality, even as his public positioning obscures it. The challenge for democratic politics is how to have honest conversations about these constraints without abandoning the legitimate concerns that drive support for more restrictive policies. Until we solve that challenge, we'll continue to see the kind of disconnect between public theater and private reality that characterizes Khan's approach to this issue. That's all for today's deep dive into the murky waters of immigration politics and economic reality. If you found this analysis useful, make sure you subscribe to UK Connors for more unvarnished takes on the political games that shape our nation. We'll be back next week with another story the mainstream media won't tell you straight. Until then, keep questioning the numbers, keep demanding better from those who would govern us, and remember that the most important conversations are often the ones happening behind closed doors.